You've reached Hotel Pacifico, your 5-star destination for BC politicos. Press 4 for room service. Press the star key for your hosts Mike McDonald and Kate Hammer.
Welcome, Hotel Pacifico guests. We have a great episode in store for you today in the hotel library. But first, I have to explain a mystery that's unfolding here at the Hotel Pacifico, our missing host, Kate Hammer. Yeah, she will not be joining us today because she has been compelled to perform her civic duty as a member of a jury. And I'm not sure what courthouse or what trial, but she felt it important enough not to do what most of us do, which is try to get out of jury duty. So, Kate, we hope it's not a 6-month trial, and we hope you'll be back next week. But Geoff, under the Jury Act, I think sheriffs can actually go out and force people on the street to attend a trial, even this day and age. Yeah,
it's true. And I can't imagine that if she said she was scheduled to do an important podcast, that they wouldn't have let her out immediately. So I think it's a tribute to her commitment to public service that she's going to, I think for a week, very serious thing. But jury trials are great, a very important part of our democracy, in my opinion. So good for her.
Yeah, it's probably not as famous as the OJ trial, but you never know what can happen. Now, today, I'd like to introduce a guest. We'll introduce a guest who needs no introduction. Keith Baldrey from Global News, and he who has the most famous bookshelf in British Columbia right behind him. Keith, welcome to Hotel Pacifico.
Great to be here.
Good to see you, Keith.
Yeah. Hi, Geoff.
We are honored by your presence. Now, we're going to do something a little different today. We're going to talk about, it's Christmas time. We're going to talk about books that have been on your bookshelf, but other books that explain BC politics. And the ones that, that are high on your list, my list, Geoff's list, and we'll just use that as an excuse to talk politics. But there's a lot that has been written over the years, maybe not enough in some cases, but some interesting titles that may be of interest to our audience.
Yeah, so there's been some gaps, I think, of governments that haven't really been scrutinized by journalists or authors. But there's been some great books covering sort of the modern era of BC politics, which many historians peg from 1933 on. But really, I think from 1952 on, with W.A.C. Bennett's administration, I think David Mitchell's book on on W.A.C. Bennett, I think, is one of the pillars of history books covering BC politics and BC politicians. But there's a number of others. I'm sure we're going to talk about quite a few of them, because there's a lot of good books, I think, that have been written about BC politics and BC history. I agree with you, Mike. And probably not enough. There you go.
Yeah, with Gary Mason.
Yeah, Geoff's holding up a copy of Fantasyland, which was written by Keith Baldrey and Gary Mason in the late 1980s or 1990s?
Late 1980s, about the Van der Zalm government, while Van der Zalm was still in office. And I remember the book come out, and Van der Zalm was Van der Zalm. He came up to me in the hallway and said, "I've talked to all my friends. No one's going to buy your book." Okay, that's fine, Bill.
And it was a bestseller.
Yeah, but it sold about 5,000 copies. So which sort
counts
of
as a bestseller.
It's huge.
It's sort of a behind the scenes account of the zaniness of and the roller coaster that was the Van der Zalm government. All sorts of scandals and resignations and controversies. It was exhilarating to cover him. I don't think at my age now I could actually cover his government. It was one of those exhausting type things. But, Fantasyland was a pretty good book, as was the one that Geoff co-wrote on the NDP government.
Well, we'll get to Geoff in a second here, but let's stick with the free enterprise side of the equation here for a minute, because you mentioned David Mitchell's book on W.A.C. Bennett, and that really is a foundational piece that explains everything that happened from 1952 for the next several decades. W.A.C. Bennett getting elected in 52, he served in 1972, and how he took this party out of obscurity, although they were governing in Alberta, but in BC they were in obscurity, and fashioned it into a, partly by luck, but partly through his own daring do, into a government that weaved its way into a 20-year reign. And Mitchell, it was a substantial piece of research. It was based on interviews with W.A.C. Bennett after he left office. And that book really has stood the test of time.
Oh, for sure. I've actually read it a couple times now. I always keep it here to always sort of leaf through it just to recall some of the episodes that occurred. And you're right, it was a phenomenal piece of research. And he did have this exclusive long interview with W.A.C. Bennett, who wasn't given to doing a lot of in-depth interviews with people. So clearly there was a level of trust there that allowed Mitchell to sort of delve fairly deeply into the whole Bennett administration and his mindset. And it's a great account, as you say. It was a sort of a nothing party, and he used it as a vehicle to power. And how he was, he's called, canny and crafty was W.A.C. Bennett. And he certainly was. And Mitchell's book paints a very good portrait of someone who was a very sort of a master politician, not only with the public, but with how the system worked and how you could, his account of how actually convincing the lieutenant governor that he should form government within a minority situation is quite revealing. So you're right, it is the foundational book. Margaret Ormsby's book I've got here, which is a first edition of her book, actually, The History of British Columbia, I think is another sort of foundational piece. It's more of not really a political history so much as it's the history of BC.
The underpinnings, yeah. How we got here.
And it's a first edition. And you know how you can tell it's a first edition? Because the chapter on Richard McBride, the premier, is called The People's Dick. And the second edition, remove that title. Margaret Ormsby and her publisher were not known for their...
Seemed like a good idea at the time.
Some of these titles don't last. Yeah.
The Mitchell book on W.A.C. Bennett, I think it's called W.A.C. is the title.
So, yeah.
That really talks about the Big Bang impact of 1952, and a completely party comes out of nowhere and straight to government and puts an end to the first 50 years of party government, which was liberal conservative. And then your book, Fantasyland, just precedes another big bang, which was the demise of the Social Credit Party and the rise of the BC Liberals as the free enterprise alternative, starting in the 1990s. Now, let's talk about today. Do you think there's another big bang coming?
Hard to see that, given the fractured state of the opposition in this province. It seems if that big bang is going to occur, it's not going to occur for some time yet. But I don't discount it occurring again. The big bang is the Free Enterprise Coalition, if that's what you want to call it, is a tough thing to put together, I think, and it's over time harder to keep it together. And it's going to be, I think, elusive to put it together on a short-term basis. But long-term, governments of all stripes start to get a little long in the tooth. And the NDP government right now is riding fairly high in the polls. But inevitably, over time, it's going to take on baggage and become stale. Few governments can last forever. And that gives the time for the other side to sort of get it together. But I think it's a little premature to think the big bang is coming. I think...
to go back
it's a fascinating time of BC politics, for sure.
To go back to your book, though, and Van der Zalm was certainly that social conservative populist who emphasized his anti-gay feelings. He called a progressive sort of sexual education thing the longest condom ad in history. Yep. There's a lot of great material. He certainly resonated with small business and people like that in a way that John Rustad is trying to. Are we seeing something new with the development of the Conservative Party, the way it's happening, or is it simply an echo or a recapitulation of what we saw in the 80s? Do you see differences?
Well, I think there's a constituency out there that is significant. It's not anywhere near a majority, and it's really, I think, more again reflects the rural-urban divide that exists in BC. I think that social conservatism is much stronger outside of urban areas and suburban areas than it is in the more heavily populated, which means there's more ridings of the urban areas. And I think what we're seeing now is the reflection of that rural-urban divide. Van der Zalm kept his social conservatism largely in check until after the 86 election. Even though he was controversial as a cabinet minister under Bill Bennett and did, declare war on welfare cheats and that type of thing, which was sort of that right-wing kind of populism, if you will.
Give him a shovel, yeah.
Yeah, give him a shovel, put him to work. But he didn't get into, it was when he got into the abortion situation where everything fell apart. when he arbitrarily cut off funding for abortion services without even consulting his caucus. That led to all sorts of internal dissension. And what had been that free enterprise coalition put together by WAC and rebuilt by Bill Bennett by basically recruiting liberals to cross the floor in the 1970s, genuine liberals, like Pat McGeer, Alan Williams, and Gardy Gardam, and along with conservative Hugh Curtis. That really cemented that free enterprise coalition. And Van der Zalm, even though ironically, people forget this, Van der Zalm ran for the leadership of the BC Liberal Party.
Against David Anderson.
Against David Anderson in the I think early 1970s.
72, yeah.
And so he came from that sort of liberal background, but he was very heavily a social conservative. And that abortion situation tore that free enterprise coalition apart. And so Rustad's problem, he hasn't raised abortion as an issue, but it's tough for a social conservative movement to meld itself or weld itself to the liberal side of the equation in any attempt for a coalition. And that's the challenge I think the opposing forces to the NDP have. How do you put significant conservative people with liberal people? Gordon Campbell kept them in check. So did Christy Clark, and didn't stray too heavily one way or another. And right now, you've got the two opposition parties here tilting significantly to the right, and that could alienate the sort of the liberal side of what could be a coalition.
Well, you saw it. Sec, just Mike. I want to follow up on the Ormsby book because it's so much about politics, party politics. But what's your take on Jean Barman, another fabulous historian, but who really talks more about women, social movements, Indigenous things, the early days of formation? Is that a whole new current in BC political analysis that is reflected in what we're seeing at the party level?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I think it's a parallel narrative to what is traditional history. And I think that may be sort of a type of book that emerges in coming years, is that type of looking at things with fresh eyes. For example, no books really delve deep into Indigenous history or the increasingly large role Indigenous people are going to play in politics and political policy decisions. UNDRIP, for example, is going to start changing things significantly over time. And no history book yet has tackled that side of what's going on. The other thing is, you mentioned the role of women in politics. I like to give tours to people at the legislature. Global viewers are always stopping me, and I always show them the class photos, the photo of the chamber, all the MLAs that is taken after every election, and how it's changed over the years. And the current last couple of photos are almost 50-50 in terms of gender equality. So many more people represented, people of color and ethnic diversity on display in the legislative chamber. And I take them back to show the photos of the early 1980s, 1970s, or even earlier, when there's hardly any women, no people of color, again, not reflective of society. And our legislature now is much more reflective. I think that's going to start showing up in more contemporary historical accounts of BC politics, not just the party politics, but the makeup of the people who form those parties, which has really shifted fundamentally since I started here in '86. And it's a completely different looking legislative chamber than back then.
Yeah, and certainly one of the more high-profile books in the last couple of years on the Indigenous side, even though it's more of a federal than a provincial angle, is Jody Wilson-Raybould's. Has, I think, a couple books out in the last couple of years. So that's emerging more.
Her book's been on my shelf behind me. Yeah.
There you go. Another book that's just kind of a foundational piece, which came out in the last couple of years posthumously by UBC history professor, Robert McDonald. It's called A Long Way to Paradise, which is the political history of BC from 1871 to 1972. Now that sounds pretty dry, but it's actually, and I've been plowing through it, but there's a lot in the details from decade to decade that is surprising when you go back and read it again, because there's things like, wow, I didn't know that, or I forgot about it, or that's how we got here to today. Speaking of coalitions, I mean, 1941 seems like a long time ago, but that's when the Liberal government under Patello fell apart, and they explicitly went to a coalition based on a vote on the convention floor of a Liberal convention in 1941, and the vote turned a certain way against Patello. He resigned. a new premier came in, invited the conservatives in. And that was a pretty foundational piece too. So sometimes those history books have a few gems in them for
Well, I
political
recommend
junkies.
Rob's book. It's great, and as you say, it was his life's work, and he died just before it could get published. So it was fun, but it doesn't have any peers. It's very comprehensive and full of detail.
Yeah, not a lot. There's not enough accounts of the pre-Patello or pre-coalition, or even of the coalition government. I mean, Mitchell's book does touch upon that because WAC became a disaffected member of the Conservative Party. But there's not, I have to, again, reading Margaret Ormsby's book, I have to confess, I wasn't familiar, I continue not to be that familiar with British Columbia of the 1800s or the early 20th century.
Churning through premiers on a regular basis.
Yeah, well, we don't teach this in school. Like school kids, we were not taught any BC history for any significance in high school or even elementary school. It was sort of this whole new world of information. So yeah, his book, I haven't picked it up yet, but I intend to, because I'd like to know more about BC in the 20s and 30s and 40s. I mean, I'm very conversant with WAC moving forward. But before WAC, there's not as much material out there, I think, to really take a deep dive.
Yeah, and the Patello book on Patello by Robin Fisher is another one that's I think a staple for those really interested in BC political history. But let's talk about books about the NDP and maybe explain, their thinking over time. And I just see over your left shoulder there, Keith, a book by a guy named Meggs.
And Mickleborough.
Rod Mickleborough.
Don't leave him out.
Won't leave out Rod Mickleborough. He's the journalist of the duo.
Hey,
but that's on the Barrett years. And I actually, Geoff, you may recall, you and I met in a bar one day so that I could get your book autographed by you. I didn't know you that well then, but I did recognize it as a significant piece of BC political history. And what really stuck out to me in that book was how activist, or at least I guess productive, the Barrett government was in terms of the volume of legislation, like just going on all fronts. And that was before the day of a big bureaucracy. So it was really the ministers driving the agenda like you don't see today. Yeah.
Oh, I know. The book's a great account of really what was almost a revolutionary government when you think of it. The massive amount of legislation and landmark legislation that exists to this day. The Agricultural Land Reserve, ICBC, the Labor Code, even things like Hansard, a question period that we all take for granted now, the product of the Barrett government. So I think it's a very unique government. I think Geoff's book and Rod's book captures the nature of that government very well. In its sort of this pent-up appetite for change that had been existing for years, but just would build up under WAC. And as the party went from the CCF to the NDP and suddenly get into power, and it's like, let's remake the world. It's quite an astonishing, and it almost moved too fast, I would argue, where they were ahead of the electorate in terms of doing things that what the electorate wanted, and which is why I think they were vulnerable to an election defeat, which of course they found, I think, prematurely, only after 3 years and a bit in 1975.
Well, Geoff, as the co-author of that book, and then being chief of staff to John Horgan, what lessons did you take out of your research and your experience looking at 75?
Both of us were interested in Barrett, but from my standpoint, it was reading the negative accounts of the Barrett government, usually in academic literature, that was a nightmare, written usually by senior public servants at the time, a complete waste of time, disastrous consequences in many areas, and then collapsed in ignominious defeat because of the quirky, crazy behavior of Barrett, which was even a view held in a lot of New Democratic circles, including back east, where senior leaders of the NDP were irritated by Barrett's populism, especially. So I was, my view, and Rod's was a bit different take, but similar, was to rehabilitate Barrett as a constructive leader. And there was, as Keith says, a ton of material to work with. That's not to say that it was a perfect administration by any means, but we wanted to give people a sense of what was achieved and what was still visible around us as a result of the work that was done. And I think that, it's I was really happy with the way it turned out, frankly. You thwarted our ambitions in the 2013 election, Mike, but I do think that for people who were still maybe not even born when Barrett was defeated, many people now in this government were not born when the government was defeated. It's a valuable piece of information about BC, but we don't have that in the same way, even about the Gordon Campbell administration. I don't know if you're going to talk about that, Keith, but to me, that's a gaping hole. Maybe we could talk further about the NDP, of course, but there's a lot to be said for and against the Campbell years that have not been said either way at this point.
Well, on the Barrett years, I think that book was looking back and reframing it, as you said. There was a book that came out not long after the Barrett years, which the Free Enterprise side of the spectrum would hold up, and I believe, Keith, that was 1,200 Days.
1,200 Days, yeah,
which was seen as the Bible. The Bible.
It was written in about 120 days.
Not nowhere. It's got some interesting parts to it, but I don't think it.
But that had a first mover advantage in terms of like defining that era. Just as Mark Milkey's book on the 90s, the NDP 90s, was important to opponents of the government to have something to rally around.
Struck also, and Jeff, some of this is in Jeff and Rod's book, is just also the negative media coverage from the major media that the Vancouver Sun, for example, I think was a little over the top sometimes in its coverage of the Barrett government. It increased the staff over here. Some of the headline, we've got a headline in the press gallery right now, front page of the Vancouver Sun back in 1972. And it's like, part of the headline, business holds its breath. As if this is like almost the Allende government coming into power in British Columbia, imported from Chile. So I think the media coverage was a bit over the top with the Barrett government, much more so than we've seen in other administrations.
We should acknowledge as a appendix to the Barrett book that Jeff co-wrote is the recent book, Bob Williams biography.
Yeah,
and I can't remember the title. Is it just Bob Williams or? I can't. It's co-written by Ben Isett, who's a former Victoria City councillor. Anyways, there's very few biographies about BC politicians, certainly below premier level as well. So it's
I quite enjoyed the Williams book. I thought it was it had some fresh stuff. Now, to read it, you would think Bob Williams came up with everything.
Yes.
In the Barrett government.
If only those bureaucrats would get out of the way.
Yeah, it
wasn't for those pesky bureaucrats.
He really goes after the bureaucracy. And that reflects, I remember when he was hired by Glenn Clark as a advisor on Crown corporations, I think it was, and I would ask Glenn from time to time, what's Bob up to? He says, he's conducting his war trials of senior civil servants. He really had a withering view of the civil service. And I think he viewed them as a holdover from the W.C. Bennett regime and that they were somehow tied. He rejected the notion that they were independent civil servants. He thought many of them were simply Socreds in disguise or thinly disguised and didn't trust them. And that came through in his book. The other thing about his book, I think it was a pretty good portrait of the legislature in the 1960s when he first came into office, about how MLAs did not have offices. And there's a great anecdote in the book. I have no idea how real it is, but he talked about how he put his desk in the speaker's corridor. So made W.A.C. Bennett walk past him every day to get into the chamber to finally convince W.A.C. to open up.
It was a part-time job back then, MLAs.
It was a part-time job until the Barrett government. But it's a pretty good account of the 1960s from a different perspective than a Socrat.
So it's using power well, Bob Williams in the making of British Columbia.
Mm-hmm.
And a few parallels to Williams in terms of MLA cabinet minister with that type of force of nature. And I love the anecdote in Jeff's book about Williams and Barrett meeting at the only seafood restaurant, which I used to basically live at when I lived in Gastown as a university student. And I think, Jeff, that's where they put the cabinet together or something. Over
they had no transition plan. Williams brought it along, written on the back of a manila envelope, and they sat down. And
quite amazing.
Yeah, so it's great to have those stories that just add to the color and get beyond the kind of dry academic review of history.
Well, so much of BC politics is personality, right?
Yeah.
And we've got some really larger than life personalities that have been on display from all the parties over the years. And I think few provinces can rival us, I think, in those types of colorful leaders.
Well, fast forward to today. I mean, the more recent best-selling book about BC politics is your colleague, Richard Zussman and Rob Shaw, A Matter of Confidence, which, kind of rolled it all up between, from, I guess, around 2011 to 2017. So a lot's been said about that book, but it's an important addition to the times, because as Geoff was saying earlier, not every era has that kind of overview summary of here's what happened, folks. And Rob and Richard did that for kind of an important era, leading up to and following the confidence vote, obviously, which they were nice enough to allow me to see a preview of their book and provide feedback on what I viewed as inaccuracies. And they didn't accept my advice that the throne speech quote was, may have been miscounted. But they asked me at the end of our little process, because I was just fixing spelling mistakes and things like that. They said, "Well, what do you think of the book?" And I said, "I hated it." And you're a little crestfallen. They said, "Well, why?" I said, "Well, the ending sucked."
I think it's a great book, and which you can see by my endorsement on the cover.
Yes.
I think it's a great account of a real historic time. We don't see, we haven't had a confidence vote since the WEC manufactured one in the early 50s. But this, as you know, Mike and Geoff, it was a very dramatic time. It was, I love telling the story to people when the two pictures, the class photos, when everybody flips from side to side, taken a few months apart, because one side goes into opposition, one side goes into government, and the atmosphere around the building that day was absolutely electric. And Mike, you might have bad memories of that, but I just remember it being just really vibrant, emotional, and electric. And I think Richard and Rob's book really does capture the behind the scenes action that was going on from both sides. It's quite a.
It was quite a day.
And Mike and Keith, we've talked about books written by academics like David Mitchell or by journalists. In both cases, they're kind of paid to be there and pay attention. And I don't see, I see a dwindling number of people in the press gallery and a process that may accelerate, and not so many academics following it. How will we do the history of the coming period? Do you worry about it at all?
I do worry about it. Hopefully it doesn't take on a form of artificial intelligence. But there's a dwindling number of people in the press gallery. There's a dwindling number of writers out there covering this. Magazines are disappearing, newspapers disappearing or shrinking in number. And you just don't have that same constant account. So one of the challenges anyone's going to have of writing a history of future BC governments is, what is your source going to be? For many years, the source could be an avalanche of newsprint. Newspaper articles. Stan Persky, we haven't talked about him. He wrote a number of books about the Socreds.
Very good.
Based entirely on Vancouver Sun and Vancouver Province articles. That was his sole source of research. That's going to disappear. If it's disappearing already. We just don't see the same volume of coverage coming available to scholars, whether they're academics or journalists, in the coming years, to really pay attention to what happened with that government. You cannot really cover a government through Hansard. Or stuff like that. You've got to take contemporary accounts, somewhat subjective accounts, written by journalists for the most part, or academic papers. And I am worried about that in future governments. We're not going to see the same type of scrutiny and the same type of research paid. And that's going to be a problem for someone trying to write it.
Well, Richard and Rob were in a position to call BS on stuff if it was said to them, because they were there seeing it unroll, and then we're able to go back and get the backstory. Whereas it's very difficult for someone arriving on the scene who didn't see it the first time to know what questions to ask or what answers to turn away from. Yeah, no, it's going to be. We just renovated the press gallery, and I went up there because of some asbestos was found. So we got rid of those historic desks. It looked like a Charles Dickens bottle washing factory. And we sort of restored it, but there's a lot of empty desks up there. There's not a lot of bodies.
When I started here with the Vancouver Sun at the press gallery, for a session, we'd have 3 reporters and a columnist, sometimes 2 columnists. And now it's 1 reporter and Vaughn, and that's it. So, and that means, again, back to the volume of coverage.
Yeah.
When I started at the Sun, we would file a list of stories every day, and we would frequently, when the House was in session, file 14 stories a day of the Van der Zalm government. And that's just unheard of now. So there's a huge volume of historical record available for the 80s and 90s. Less so once we get into this century, as reporters the news hole shrinks. There's no way Katie DeRosa of the Vancouver Sun will ever file 14 stories from here on a daily basis. Now it's 1 story, maybe 2, and that's just pales in comparison to the past. So that's troubling for historians going forward.
Right. Well, there have been, other than journalists, there have been firsthand accounts written about BC politics over the years, primarily by politicians who were part of it and had to get it out of their system, or biographers of politicians. And just to name a few, we talked about the social credit collapse in the late 80s, part to the abortion issue. And maybe not everyone understands that the first female Prime Minister of Canada was part of that caucus who resigned her seat, Kim Campbell, to run federally, and lo and behold, 5 years later, she's Prime Minister of Canada. She wrote a book, Time and Chance, which is, Kim Campbell's still around 30 years later since she left office as Prime Minister, but no one else has been able to vault over her as a female Prime Minister and serve longer. So, and the only native-born, British Columbia-born Prime Minister ever, I believe, in Canada. So, pretty noteworthy BC political angle there.
I think Kim Campbell's resignation is one of the more pivotal resignations in BC history. That really precipitated and accelerated the collapse of the Social Credit Party. That she had run for a couple times, I think, before she was actually elected. She broke with Van der Zalm in very, very strong terms, and she didn't go quietly. I remember running into Kim in the hallway when she was resigning, and she hung around to make sure every reporter was able to talk to her, and she did not mince words, and that led to other members of the caucus seeing what Kim had done, and that's when everything just fell apart. I was glad to see Kim become Prime Minister. I think she was a remarkable one. It's an amazing
story of trailblazing there.
So we talked about people, but I would like to talk about some huge events you were there for, and just get your take on them. So if we go back to Van der Zalm and conflict of interest and all of the issues around that, the Expo lands, there were 4 or 5 with him, but basically conflict of interest is an issue. We had the so-called bingo gate, Nanaimo bingo scandal, the strangest one ever, I think, with Mike Harcourt, but it drove him out of office. BC Rail did not drive Gordon Campbell out of office, but notably had a police raid on the legislature itself. Glenn Clark's episode that I was around for with ultimately cleared, but forced out of office as a result of the investigation. When you look back at these, can you draw any themes out, or are there any events that really stick out for you when you think back on these huge events in BC political history?
Well, some of these events were huge, and I think they were unfair to the people involved. I thought the casino thing with Clark, and you were right there in the Premier's office, I thought that was completely overblown. I thought BC Rail was completely overblown by the RCMP. I think Bingo Gate was this twisted pretzel of logic that nobody really understood. And I think Harcourt could have stuck it out. I don't think he had to quit. He just suddenly out of the blue quit. We had 20 minutes notice that he was doing this. It had been rumored. It was only rumored for a day of maybe this is going to happen. Van der Zalm was much more clear cut. It was very obvious he was in a conflict with the Taiwanese.
The paper bags of money are usually a tell.
Paper bags of money usually get an indication.
But a formidable conflict commissioner, Ted Hughes.
Yeah, he was Deputy Attorney General. And Van der Zalm a de facto conflict commissioner, we all thought, I wouldn't want to put my future in Ted Hughes's hands in terms of something like this. And then he became the formal conflict. So before we had a conflict of interest commissioner under Van der Zalm, we had ministers resigning left and right over conflicts simply because the media reported on them. In fact, the press gallery was basically the conflict commissioner. Then we had an official one. So that's one of the big changes is that's occurred on that type of behavior is now we have a formal arbiter who's going to decide whether someone's in conflict, not the opposition or the media joining together saying you're in conflict. I remember when in the 80s, Glenn Clark stood up and accused Peter Duick, who was then the health minister, I think, of that he should resign because he was in a conflict because of his health minister. His deputy minister was under police investigation. So Duick resigned. And I phoned Glenn later and said, well, you've done it. Duick's resigned. And he said, what? What are you talking about? Well, I didn't really mean that sort of thing. But that's what happened in those days. So that's one of the big changes that's occurred. But I think some of these events, they get tons of coverage sometimes, and the opposition breathes some life into them. But they're not as big as.
But when you had a bigger
established the perception of conflict as a problem, which is that's a field day for anybody who's able to land a tough enough blow. Really,
I think one of the more groundbreaking and historical scandals that continues to reverberate was the Bill Reid scandal, because that led to the creation of the special prosecutor system. Which is really another fundamental change in politics. When again, we have a special prosecutors brought in on politically sensitive cases. And that stems from the Owen inquiry, which was into the Bill Reid scandal, which involved him shifting lottery money to his former campaign manager. So that led to a host of changes as well. The BC Rail scandal is interesting. There was a raid on the legislature, very dramatic and all that. But I remember the former head of Victoria Police at the time telling me that is his experience, and in his words, anytime the RCMP gets near politics, it's like they're on crack cocaine. And that was a good example with BC Rail, where they thought this is this huge network of corruption at the BC legislature when it wasn't. I mean, two political aides ended up basically taking the fall because they took a free plane trip and football tickets to a Denver Broncos game. That's what that whole thing basically was all about. So, but again, to hear the RCMP tell it again with Glenn Clark as well, something really big and nefarious was going on when at the end of the day, it wasn't.
Yeah, well, well, maybe these scandals were so big back then because, as you said earlier, the press gallery was huge. Yeah. And there's a lot of people chasing these stories and giving them a lot of oxygen. And I remember, I can't even remember what the scandal was, but one that's been forgotten to history. I remember the Vancouver Sun doing an entire section on it with like 6 reporters writing stories. Oh, certainly one BC Hydro, the power in Pakistan thing was massive, a massive scandal.
Another almost incomprehensible scandal.
Yeah. Which Glenn Clark moved deftly to...
I remember
it was a leadership test for him.
As the Liberals were announcing this in the press theater, Clark phoned me and said, so what do they got? And I said, what's this hydro? He goes, oh, I know. The hydro thing? I said, I'm just going to fire a couple of people. And that's what he did. It looked like he was taking action.
The chair and the CEO, to be clear.
Yeah.
But they walked the plank and he got reelected or got elected.
Adrian Dix maintains that scandal actually did hurt Clark, when a lot of us argue that it sort of allowed him to define himself as a man of action sort of thing. And so Adrian counters that narrative.
Okay. Just a couple more in the minutes we've got left here. I just want to acknowledge a couple Indigenous politicians in British Columbia who've written books or had books written about them over the years. Frank Calder served Atlan from 1949, the year that Indigenous people were given the vote.
Well, I've got 2 minutes.
Okay. So Frank Calder, he moved to Mountain, 30 years less a term in the legislature. It's an important person to remember. And Len Marchand, federal MP, whose son just became the Chief Justice of British Columbia, biography on him called Breaking Trails. I wanted to acknowledge their efforts. But Keith, bring it home with, what are you going to be reading over the holidays about BC?
I may reread some of these books. As a matter of fact, I may even reread Geoff's book because I'm still trying to get a handle on. I always find the evolution in the NDP fascinating to see how it evolves. The government of David Eby is different than the government of John Horgan, which was different than the government of Dave Barrett. But one thing I have yet to finish, I still have my Ormsby book here. I'm only halfway through her magisterial history of BC, so I'll probably be reading this over the holidays.
Great. Well, thanks for joining us today. We appreciate
My
that.
pleasure.
Great talk, Keith. Good to see
All right,
you.
guys.
Great. Thanks, Lucky.
Guess, do you remember 2006? Stephen Harper was elected as Canada's 22nd Prime Minister. A record-breaking windstorm knocked over some of Stanley Park's biggest and oldest trees. Two aspiring pop artists, Taylor Swift and Paris Hilton, both launched their debut albums. Also, somehow Pluto stopped being a planet? Honestly, I'm still processing that one. That's the year I finished grad school, and in hindsight, guess, it was pretty lucky timing. Because in 2006, the average undergraduate tuition in Canada was $4,400, and the average cost of a home was about $275K. For those graduating today, average tuition is more like $6,800, and the average cost of a home has more than doubled to about $650K. Yeah. There are a lot of good reasons for a new grad to continue bunking in their parents' basement. And sorry, boomer, it's got nothing to do with avocado toast. Because inflation and a slowing economy hit students particularly hard. And what's good for new grads is good for the workforce, is good for the economy, and is good for all of us. That's why presenting sponsor Talis launched the largest national bursary fund in Canada for post-secondary education, the $50 million Talis Student Bursary. This academic year alone, the foundation has awarded $2 million to 400 students in financial need. University students get up to $5,000 in bursaries, as well as networking and mentoring opportunities and free mobile and low-cost internet plans. Each bursary recipient commits to undertaking a project that will have a positive social, environmental, or health impact. By equipping underserved students with the resources, financial support, and guidance they need to gain vital life skills and launch their careers, Talis is empowering future leaders to get to work making our world a better place. Even a world without a ninth planet called Pluto. Applications will open again this spring. To apply, or for more information, go to friendlyfuture.com/bursary.
Hello. You've reached the Hotel Pacifico Strategy Suite.
Well, this week on the Strategy Suite, Geoff and I, as we noted, are down a person here. Kate usually does such a great job of conducting our business that we're a little discombobulated, but we'll do our best.
We'll have to struggle on.
So let's harken back to, first of all, to Keith Baldrey's segment. There's a ton of things we didn't get to. There's so many great BC books, not just about politics, but history and geography and all sorts of things. So you and I are going to put together a little list and throw it up on the Air Quotes website. So
We will. Yeah.
So
Some of the ones we referenced, and maybe a few others. We didn't talk about Fire Weather by John Villant, which is really about Fort McMurray, but has a lot of resonance here because of the fire season. Great writer.
Yeah. So we'll round out the list for those who are interested and keen. We just can't help ourselves being bookworms ourselves. But this week in politics, what are you seeing out there, Geoff?
Well, I don't want to say that Vancouver is the city or center of the universe, because it definitely is not. And it is in BC politics, maybe more than it should be. But Ken Sim, after a relatively quiet year that was a bit, I would say more to the positive than the negative for him, has now taken on two huge fights, which one is the cancellation or the elimination of the park board. He's going to go to the province and ask them to change the charter to eliminate the elected park board, which is one of only two in North America, apparently. I'm not even sure where the other one is, maybe in Cultus Lake or something, he said. But this is a hot button issue for a lot of people in Vancouver. And I don't know that it's going to be a welcome amendment from the standpoint of the government, because there's a lot of front bench Vancouver MLAs, including Nikki Sharma, who was a member of the park board, Spencer Chandler Herbert, who was a member of the park board, David Eby, who was not a member of the park board, but whose voters are going to be very interested in this issue, who may come to the provincial level and say, we would like to now lobby you about how you handle this request from the Vancouver Council. We'll see. Perhaps those who say the park board is a ridiculous anachronism and an incompetent throwback to a previous era are right, and the voters will simply yawn at this. But it's in a package with the mayor's decision to open the issue of the view corridors, which are considered, I know, an obscure frill by a lot of people, but were set up by Gordon Campbell to make sure that as towers are built on the downtown peninsula, there would still be peekaboo views of the Lions and things like that. And I, for one, have always enjoyed that when I walk along the seawall. That is also attracting a lot of attention, with Larry Beasley and Peter Busby, two eminent planners and architects, holding a forum at Simon Fraser that had 400 in the room and at least as many online. So I think the mayor's heading into the new year with a couple of hot issues on his hands, and we'll see how they play. The view cones have nothing to do with the province, but the park board changes have to be made in the legislature, and it'll be interesting to see how keen the government is prepared to do that right before an election.
Well, I wouldn't want to mess with Larry Beasley or Peter Busby, both Order BC recipients, but
Order of Canada as well, man.
Order of Canada, pardon me.
Yeah.
But let's leave them aside for a second and go back to the park board. Don't you think Mayor Sim already knew that he was going to get that amendment from the province when they went out and made that decision?
Probably, because they've got a very solid relationship.
Yeah.
But commitment can change. I mean, it's a miscellaneous statute thing. We'll see. There's been a bipartisan lobby of former park board commissioners already at the meeting this week, demanding that everybody change their mind and go back to the status quo. So we'll see.
It could actually be a private member's bill.
Well,
it's not a money vote.
It could also be a referendum, which is what Francis Bueller raised, and I think that may catch some fire too.
I'm just thinking that if it's a government bill, then Nikki Sharma doesn't have a choice. She's got to support it as a member of cabinet. But a private member's bill may be a different story.
Good angle, yeah.
But you would think the mayor would have an expectation that this is going to happen if he's coming out to the public and asking the province to do this. He's breaking some glass. And I think some early polls that I saw show that, I don't know how valid they are, but that people support it without probably knowing a lot about it. And I don't think the opposition's really got a head of steam yet. But I'm thinking that we haven't heard the second part of the story, which is like, what is the benefit of getting rid of the park board? Is there a savings here? Is it material? Is it going to help them lower taxes? Like, that part of the story I didn't hear as part of the coverage.
Well, I know my old colleague, George Affleck, and also on the other side of the room, he was with the MPA at the time.
Yeah.
Argues that there's $50 million to be saved, which would amount to almost 6 or 7% in taxes. I doubt that. I don't know. I think I just don't see it. There's it's really a department of the city already, but who knows? There's a lot of ways to create anxiety about what might happen in the absence of an elected park board, like privatization and all that kind of stuff. And I think we haven't heard the end of all of those nightmare scenarios either.
Taking a different tack, what do you think about, because this has always irritated me, what about getting rid of school boards? I mean, what do school boards do anyways? And
what municipalities? Why don't hold back?
Well, let's go for the. I'm not going that far, but like, we got a separate. You got a school board, you got a separate works yard. The municipality has a separate works yard. I just think these days the province decides most of the things about education, just as they do on healthcare. So, like, are we just keeping these school boards around as a kind of a fictitious local governance example that doesn't really play out that way?
It is a slippery slope, and people will wonder why we have Anmore or Belcarra or Bowen, or Lions Bay. Municipal amalgamation would help handle a lot of these housing issues too, but I don't know how many of those hot buttons anybody wants to push, especially in the coming number of months.
Well, we could have like a football pool or something where we draft the municipalities we want to amalgamate, and because I've got a list.
Okay.
Anyways, we digress. Let's talk about other news making news in provincial politics this week. And I think you and I both noticed some interesting comments from John Rustad, leader of the BC Conservatives, who said, well, maybe I'm ready to talk and have a chat about what's happening vis-a-vis BC United and BC Conservatives. And, as a former executive director of the BC Liberal Party and campaign manager, I suppose I should have a strong opinion on this, which I don't at this moment,
but you've been there, and how likely is it? I mean, we saw Jess Ketchum on the podcast a few weeks ago talk about how they forged the BC Liberal Party out of the ashes of social credit. But is there room for that kind of trusteeship now?
Well, I think at the end of the day, you need a vehicle that is capable of stretching to incorporate, on a good day, 45% of the vote. 40 would do, but 40 to 45% of the vote. And so you need a consistent, coherent approach and philosophy that's going to keep everything glued together, because there will be people with disparate views within a block the size of 40 to 45%. The problem has been that some views on the more further right part of the spectrum has made it harder to maintain support in the middle of the spectrum. Now, depending on the suite of issues, it may be easier. If the entire thing's built around affordability and the economy, it's easier because we're dealing with pocketbook. If it's anything to do with social policy or vaccinations or things like that, then it's really hard to keep that together. So I think the Conservatives on their part would have to say, look, we're not going to war over Soji and all that kind of stuff. And the BC United would have to say, okay, well, there's some things we can address that aren't a part of our policies now, and we'll make room for everybody. But that's assuming that BC United would be the vehicle, and that's not altogether clear either. The brand is not doing well, and the Conservatives have a brand that's more ascendant. So there'd be a lot to talk about, and time is ticking. Elections.
I don't see any way for Kevin Falcon, given the position he's taken and the situation he's in, to sit down and say, okay, well, let's agree on you run in this riding and I run in that riding, if that's what cooperation means. There's just no way he can do that. And that was the kind of conversation that some Green Party activists were hoping for during the CASA period.
Yeah.
You know, that we all sit down and agree that they got 5% of the world and we got another 35% or something like that. I don't think that the way the party system is set up, that's really very viable. And I don't think there's the same coherent establishment free enterprise view or established free enterprise view that you saw Jess Ketchum talking about in the 80s, for example, to effectively impose a kind of discipline on the whole situation. So we may wind up more like Alberta, where these insurgent groups with their very, very strong, social media basis wind up becoming more prominent in some reunited organization. We'll see. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean,
I don't think it looks good for Kevin Falcon, though. I think it's a tough period. I don't say that as a partisan. I just think that's the case.
Well, we touched on earlier kind of big bangs in the free enterprise side of the spectrum in history, and there's two different examples. 1975, it was more of a reorganization based on initiative taken by Bill Bennett, leader of the Social Credit Party, to bring Liberals and a Conservative into his caucus and basically just say, this is the way we're going, everybody. In the 90s, the voters decided the BC Liberals were going to be the ones who, were going to have the upper hand in the legislature, and eventually it coalesced around the BC Liberals. So today, we haven't had the election yet, so we don't know what's going to happen if things don't change. One of those two parties, BC United Conservatives, will finish ahead of the other, and that may decide it. All we know right now is there's some polls that show that things are a little muddled, and there's a lack of confidence that those parties are going to get their act together and figure out how to defeat the NDP. So I guess this is a stay tuned.
Yeah, it can change fast, I know, and you've seen it too. But really, if these things aren't clear by the budget, which is going to be adopted by, in the next 120 days or so, at that point, the campaign really functionally begins, and the government doesn't have much room to do much more, and the opposition has to play the cards it's got. So we'll see quite soon.
I just want to touch on another event that happened the past week, which was the annual BC Chamber of Commerce meeting with Cabinet and the Premier, which basically is a lunch, of which 500 of your closest friends can attend if you're chamber members. And the Premier made remarks, and then, as he likes to do, sits down and takes questions, in this case from the CEO of the Chamber of Commerce, and handled a number of issues. So I'll say two things about that. First of all, the Premier has a very nice style in terms of engaging with an audience, in terms of some self-deprecating humor. He's a very conversational kind of guy. He definitely has a lot of facts at his fingertips. There's always a joke about his height. So he did this at UBCM as well. People are impressed. I will say that. People are impressed by the manner in which he delivers a message. What was noteworthy to me, that during the Q&A, there was an opportunity where his sunny demeanor got a little cloudy and stormy when he talked about the BC Business Council and their critique of the Clean BC plan. And he bristled a bit about that and announced his frustration, which I I don't see a lot of from him these days. So it got my attention, and got the attention of the room too. So that was interesting.
Yeah, I think climate's going to be an issue, and what has got him aggravated is the way the opposition was able to take a report or an analysis done by BC Business Council staff of modeling done for Clean BC. So purporting to show that the economy would be billions of dollars poorer if we carry on with Clean BC. I think what's really been helpful to the government in the last week or so was the very positive news about emissions declining, that Clean BC is having an effect on reducing emissions. The narrative that it was costing us a ton and not working is a hard one to wrestle with, but it is doing its job, and we can see a pathway to achieving the reductions we need, which is crucial for it. But also, I think Premier Eby and George Heyman in particular have been able to mount a pretty good defense to the modeling debate, which is so technical, it's very difficult to follow. But we'll see. This is one where certainly Kevin Falcon's had to defend on his right-hand flank and completely change his approach to climate policy, thanks to John Rustad. And it's not clear yet to me how that's going to play out.
Well, there certainly is a cocktail of climate, the economy, and affordability at play, and it's pushing and pulling. On the BC Business Council, I mean, they have a new CEO, Laura Jones, and they have taken a bit of a different approach. And I think it's interesting that there is a business association that's willing to tell it like it is as far as they're concerned, as opposed to sucking it up and not wanting to anger the government. I think generally it's a good thing when there's criticism, because it makes for better debate, even though when I was in government, I hated it. But criticism makes for better debate and makes for better government. Mm-hmm. And a lot of times business associations or industry associations go along to get along because they don't want to be in trouble, and they don't really say what's on their mind. So in this case, BC has said it, and they're getting a little blowback, but I think there's probably some people nodding silently.
Well, full disclosure, I now do some work, as some people know, with Greg Davenant, who was the previous CEO of the Business Council, but I don't see the Business Council changing away from some really fundamental commitments that I thought were new. One was that they were very committed to reconciliation during the last number of years, and actually showed a lot of leadership in that regard. It'll be a big departure if that changes, but I don't see that changing. The other was they were committed to climate change, but always, whoever was there, made sharp criticisms, although more privately now than maybe the current, than Laura Jones is doing, about how Clean BC was playing out, especially about the carbon pricing and all that kind of stuff. But it's such a technical area that it's very, very difficult, unless you get a report like was done by their economist, Jock Finlayson, to really communicate it to the public. It becomes, in my view, pretty obscure.
You don't hear much from BC Federation of Labor anymore. Is that because the NDP are in power and they're getting it dealt with behind the scenes? Because
they don't get much coverage. I think that's true, but they are making a lot of noise about the gig economy and some of the changes that are going on. I think they're generally satisfied. There's a new president there, Suzanne Skidmore, who worked with Laird Cronk, Laird was one of the most successful Federation presidents in recent history, in my view. I've known them all. Jim Sinclair had a very long and productive time there, but Laird came from the building trades and was able to manage a lot of the internal difficulties that were there very effectively during his time. And also he was lucky enough to be there when Horgan was there, and Horgan was very interested in the building trades and some of their issues anyway. So I think Suzanne's coming along, and there's no collective bargaining happening at the moment that is of particular significance. But when that starts again, I think all bets are off. But the current contracts are going to run past the election, so I don't anticipate a big issue on that front for the time being.
Okay, Geoff, well, I'm getting thirsty. Should we head to the minibar?
Let's raise a glass or take a shot. Time to raid the minibar.
You go ahead first.
It's not Ravi Kahlon. I know I like him a lot, but this time I'm going to toast John Rustad for a couple of reasons. I think Jimmy Pattison used to say that he always felt firing his worst performers was doing them a favor because they got to move on to something where they would be more productive than working for him. And I think that is how it's worked out for John Rustad after being fired by Kevin Falcon for not being able to sign up entirely to the BC Liberals, now BC United climate policy, because since he was fired in August of 2022, he became leader in March of the Conservative Party. In September or in June, his candidate came second in the Langford by-election, which was quite a shock to everybody's system. The polls started to rise steadily. He recruited Bruce Bamman, former mayor of Abbotsford, to his ranks. That got them party status. And by October, you could see Kevin Falcon at BC United rushing to the right, making adjustments on climate policy and other fronts to try to stem some of the uproar. And now we see him raising the question of cooperation with the BC Liberals. And I understood from some tweets I saw that maybe Kevin Falcon had said, yeah, he might talk about that. I don't see that working myself, but quite a year for John Rustad. Hard for him to improve on it. If he's now at the end of the year, not that long after being fired, saying he might look at some cooperation, he's come a long way. So toast to him.
Well, to use a baseball analogy, they didn't call Reggie Jackson Mr. July. They called him Mr. October because he performed when you needed to. So right now, John Rustad might be Mr. July. We'll see if he becomes Mr. October. We'll see.
Yeah, we will. We will.
Yeah. So we weren't actually going to do a strategy suite today, but now I have to on the spot decide. So I'm going to take a shot. I'm going to go back to the BC thing and take a shot at the premier for how he handled that interaction at the BC Chamber lunch, because I think he's in a strong position right now and doesn't need to show that. I don't think he needs to show his displeasure with BC because it wasn't, in the political terms, it's not that big a deal. Like, I don't think people outside the bubble really know what he's talking about. And maybe he basically was making those comments inside the bubble. But I would say, hey, you know what? I wouldn't show it when you're bothered by the criticism, because it might indicate that you have a bit of a glass jaw. So I would say, Premier, you have a tone that seems to be working for you. Take my advice. I would just keep with your quote unquote sunny ways and save your tough stuff for when it really matters. But this is one I think you could have taken a pass on. Anyways, that's it. I think boy, I'm exhausted, Geoff. We need Kate back here. We got to make sure.
I know. It's been a long session. Hope people enjoyed it.
Let's hope the judge ends the trial. We get her back from jury duty. And I'd like to thank our presenting sponsor, Talis, for making the show happen today. And we'll welcome back all our guests to Hotel Pacifico next week. BC, you can never leave.
Checkout time at Hotel Pacifico. We hope you enjoyed your stay.